Well, good evening. Thank you all for coming out this evening. It isn't the best weather for an event like this, but looks like you're all dry, so thank you for coming. About 8 years ago this July, the space shuttle stopped flying, and since that time we have not been flying any humans into space from this country. We've been flying all the Americans into space and up to the International Space Station on the Russian Soyuz, and certainly they've done an excellent job and have been very good about supporting us, and we have an excellent relationship with our Russian colleagues in the space business, so we've been fortunate to do that. But over that time, also there's been a good bit of effort with particularly some new activity that's come into being in the space program, and that's proved even in the absence of shuttle flying has brought a lot of excitement to space, and I think has great promise for the future. And if you look at some of the activities of the new companies that have come on the scene, certainly SpaceX and Blue Origin have been very impressive with their achievements so far. SpaceX in supplying the International Space Station, and Blue Origin equally impressive in what they've been able to accomplish. And I think the other great thing that both of them have been able to do is they've also reduced the launch costs, which I think if we look at, if there's going to be a future in space and we're going to commercialize space, we're going to have to get the cost of launches down. And both of them have been very good about doing that, and have demonstrated a recoverable first stage. And that, I think, is a great achievement. And those of you that watch television, I think, certainly had to be impressed with seeing SpaceX achieve that with three of their stages coming down. Very impressive. And this evening, we're very fortunate to have an individual here with us who has, I think, written a great book about all these activities. And I think you'll hear a lot of interesting facts about these new companies and those entrepreneurs that have made it all happen. Our speaker this evening is a graduate of Colby College, and he's a writer for the Washington Post on covering defense and space industries. He's also been on a team of reporters that won the Peabody Award in 2010, and 3 times he's been on a team that competed in the finals for the Pulitzer Prize. He's a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and also a fellow at the Alicia Patterson Foundation. And it's with great pleasure I present this evening Christian Davenport. So, Christian.
Thank you to George Abbey and to Rice University and to the Baker Institute for having me. This is a real treat. I've done a fair amount of events since I've been on my book tour, and this has been a real treat. I also want to extend a thank you to Art Dula, who helped coordinate this and has been a friend and supporter of mine. Well, I'll start off by sharing a memory with you, and it's my first memory of space. And it's not a good one. It's not a happy one. It's not like so many others gathered around a black and white TV in 1969 and watching men walk on the moon. It didn't have that promise. I was 12 years old. I was home sick from school, and I was, just goofing off watching television, some game show, and the news broke in, and it was the news of the Challenger disaster breaking up and coming apart. And you'll remember that was a mission that had the teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe. So I didn't grow up like so many people in my field. They come to it because they've always been passionate about space. And I was passionate to the extent that I watched, Star Wars, but it wasn't more than that until, I'm a reporter at the Washington Post, And about 5 years ago, I just stumbled into the space beat, and I got assigned to cover a press conference at the museum. And some guy named Elon Musk was holding a press conference, and I had heard of him, and I kind of knew who he was, and it was an odd premise to the press conference. And as my editor was laying out for me, he had a space company called SpaceX, and the press conference was to announce a lawsuit against the Air Force. And he was suing the Air Force because he wanted to work for the Air Force. He wanted a contract from the Air Force. And so I said, well, why is he suing the agency that he wants to work for? But that's kind of what that was, and that was my introduction to it. And, this was in 2014, and you had all of this activity soon to follow with what Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos' company, was doing, Richard Branson and Virgin Galactic. And the more I covered it, the more I caught the sort of space bug that you hear, so many people who are passionate about this subject have. And the more I realized, this was would transcend my daily reporting for the Washington Post, that there was a bigger story to be told here, because I do think that this is an era that we'll look back on in 20 or 30 years from now as a pivotal moment, and I wanted to sort of try to capture that. One of the things I think I'll begin with is to talk about Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin. A lot of people, Elon gets a lot of press, SpaceX get a lot of press. They're very good at marketing, but a lot of people don't even realize that Jeff Bezos has a space company. They've never heard of Blue Origin, and that's in large part because he has been so secretive about it, and been so quiet and moving, almost, clandestinely for years about this. He actually, the thing was, Jeff founded Blue Origin in the year 2000, so it was actually 2 years before Elon did. And unlike me, Jeff's first memory of space was Apollo 11, and he talks about that. And, I really believe he says it was a seminal moment. He was 5 years old when he watched Neil Armstrong walk on the surface of the moon. And ever since then, he sort of knew that was what he ultimately ended up wanting to do. And you'll hear him talk now about how Amazon is this great lottery ticket that he won that allows him to fund his space program. But it's really interesting the way that he went about trying to lower the cost of spaceflight. Elon and Jeff, they both take very different approaches, and very different approaches from NASA. But Blue Origin, when it started, it was just a handful of people. It was almost like a think tank or an R&D shop. And the question that they wanted to answer was, is there a better way to get to space? I mean, do we have to use chemically fueled rockets? Is there a better way? And so they wanted to take sort of a clean sheet approach to this. And one of the people who's involved in these talks is Neil Stevenson, whose work some of you may be familiar with. He's a science fiction author. He has a book called Seven Eves. And anyway, when I was interviewing Jeff for this book, and we were talking about this, and he's telling me these stories, he said, well, you're going to want to know what some of these crazy ideas we came up with, right? Some of the alternatives. And I said, oh, yeah, I want, he's like, all right, I'll give you the most outlandish one. And he says, do you know how a bullwhip works? And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, a bullwhip actually can get to the point where it's traveling fast enough to create a sonic boom. The conservation of momentum is mass time velocity, and you, with your arm, can do that. And so I kind of look at him and I said, so you were thinking about bullwhipping people into space? And he says, oh, no, not people, but, maybe cargo, or, satellites, that sort of thing. And he said, well, as you could see, this was an idea that wasn't going to pan out. But I think that's an example of how his mind works, because one of the differences, you're talking about private entrepreneurial ventures that have sort of a Silicon Valley ethos, that want to do things untraditionally, sort of by design, instead of this is the way we've always done it, and this is the way that won't get me fired, in sort of a government bureaucracy. So I like that idea of how he did that. Another, I think, story I can tell. I'm trying to think of which one. I'll tell the one in 2013 because I think to understand Jeff Bezos, we always see him as, through the lens of Amazon, and as well we should, obviously. But I think to really understand him, you have to see him through the lens of space, that this is what he really cares about. And obviously he owns the Washington Post, where I work, and I have to tell my colleagues, it's always dicey writing about a guy who, can have you fired. And this is the richest man in the world and could probably have me done away with. But he, to understand his passion for space, I tell this story and I almost have to remind people, I'm a journalist. This is nonfiction. I don't, it's all fact-based, despite what you may hear out there. And in 2013, Jeff undertook this, you could call it quixotic, you could call it foolhardy, you could call it, brave and heroic, depending on your point of view, where he hired some of the best deep sea explorers in the world. I mean, guys who, had been going out to discover the Titanic and all of these maroon ships, and he didn't want to find a ship. He was looking for the Saturn V engines, the F-1 engines that flew the Apollo astronauts to the moon, which on that first stage on the Saturn V, as it took off from Launch Complex 39A, that first stage fell into the water. And he wanted to go out and find these engines, which, at this point, it's a bunch of metal and rusted. And who knew what kind of shape they would be in? They were going to be really hot. They're falling all the way down. They hit, the water and sink. And, this isn't like the Titanic, as one of the expedition leaders was telling me, is, fairly big. This was like, the size of a refrigerator, maybe a garbage truck. I mean, much smaller to find. And they go out on this mission to find it. And of course, they get hit with a storm like this, and they have to kind of call it off, and they're all getting sick. And Jeff's there with his I think his parents, his brother-in-law, and his brother are all on this. And wouldn't you know it, they find not just the Saturn, the F-1 engines, they find the center engine from the Apollo 11 mission. And that's Jeff clapping and saying, he did. So, I think that, is illustrative of his passion. Anybody who is willing to go do that is someone who's passionate about space. And let's be clear, SpaceX and Elon are so far ahead. And Jeff is, taking this, what he calls a step-by-step approach, very incrementally. And even though he owns the Washington Post, I had to badger them for a period of months to get them to participate, which then, thankfully, he did, and he told me these stories. But one of the key things about, I think that it's illustrated by the F-1 engine story is that the way Jeff and Elon are building rockets, and to an extent Richard Branson too, is that you don't throw them away. You recover the first stage. As I say, imagine I flew in from DC today. We had a little bit of a rough landing in this weather, but imagine if you threw away the airplane after every single flight. Well, that's what we do in space, or have been traditionally. And that's why it's been so expensive for so long, and just has been the exclusive province of government for decades. And that anyone who wanted to try on their own as an entrepreneur, they were laughed at. I don't know, that might be. Is that everyone's phone? Oh, that's funny. I have my ringer off. Well, as long as someone just tell me if we have to evacuate the building. Okay. So the other story I tell about Jeff is, someone had said to me, oh, this is his new thing, the space thing. And actually, it's not. This is something he's been thinking about since he was 5 years old. And his goal is to lower the cost of getting to space, that it's just too difficult, it's too expensive big government programs. One administration says we're going to the moon, another one says we're going to Mars. Congress cuts the funding, it doesn't work out. But he wants to lower the cost of the access to space. And his goal, I mean, these are guys who think really, really big, is that once you can do that, once you can get to space efficiently and reliably, then you can do all sorts of things. And one of what things he wants to do is take heavy industry and do it in space. I mean, this planet, its resources are finite. Our population is growing. Our demand for energy and resources is growing, especially if we've all got our Amazon Prime and our Kindles. And this is something he's thinking about and wanting to keep, Earth as this sort of gem. Whereas in space, there are virtually unlimited resources. The solar energy from the sun you can get, there's no day and night. There are precious metals on asteroids that can be mined. There are all sorts of resources. And he talks about this today, and he says we want to create, and he's talking 400 years or so out in the future, and he calls it the Great Inversion, but he says today in his stump speech about space, and yes, Jeff Bezos has a space stump speech, I've heard it many times, that he wants to keep Earth zoned residential and take heavy industry and have that in space. Now, obviously, again, that's many, many years away. But when he was a kid in high school, and obviously Jeff was quite bright in high school and graduated #1 in his class in Florida, and he gave a speech about space. And he gave the stump speech. And instead of saying, he's tweaked it, instead of saying, we want to keep Earth zoned residential, he said, we want to preserve Earth as a national park, right? So he's been talking about this for quite some time and moving very secretive, very slowly, and taking his time. And the mascot of Blue Origin is the tortoise. And I sort of set up in the narrative, Jeff is the tortoise. So if Jeff is the tortoise, the hare is Elon Musk. And he's sort of the opposite, right? He, in 2003, he trying to get attention from NASA and saying like, hey, I've got this company, SpaceX, and we're building this rocket, and nobody is paying attention to him whatsoever. So he brings a mock-up of his Falcon 1 rocket, sort of the early rocket, down to Washington, where there was the 100th anniversary of the Wright brothers' first powered flight in December of 2003, and he parades it down Independence Avenue, and he parks it in front of the FAA, where they were having this event, and NASA administrators there, and he holds this press conference out on the street, and he was this eccentric billionaire that's trying to get all of this attention. He's the kind of guy, for example, who would sue the Air Force over a contract that he would want to get. But he too wants to bring down the cost and access to space. And he too, in SpaceX, really operate in a wholly different way. And while, to my knowledge, he never came up with the idea of bullwhipping payloads into space, he's done all sorts of things, a little bit crazy. And one of the stories I tell in the book is, it was one of the early flights, I think it was the second flight, or maybe it was the first of their Dragon spacecraft. This is a spacecraft that was designed to take cargo and supplies to the International Space Station, and they're getting ready. It was a test flight. But NASA's watching this because they want to see how they're doing, because they're going to be under contract to do this. And the day before the flight, they do the pre-flight inspection on the rocket, and they notice there's a crack in the engine nozzle on the second stage engine. An engine nozzle, they call it a skirt. I mean, it looks like a skirt, and there's a crack. And all of the engineers say, well, that's that. We're not flying tomorrow. You got to take the rocket down. You got to take it apart. You got to inspect it. Probably got to go through your whole manufacturing procedures, see what's wrong, take the rocket apart. I mean, you're looking at delays of weeks, if not months. But Elon gathers his team together and says, well, where's the crack? And apparently it's just at the very edge of the engine skirt. And he says, well, can't we just cut around it? And they go, well, yeah, I mean, as if it's like your fingernail, you just clip the end off. And they said, well, it is the second stage engine, so, we're already in space, and this is going to help us, get to our orbit, and we've got some margin built into this. And they did, have their engineers, and they're all really smart people, and they calculate how much performance they would lose if they cut it. And they decided, yeah, we can do it. And NASA at this point is, they're sort of in a watch advisory role, and they're watching all this. So Elon says, okay, let's do it. And they send a guy from Hawthorne, California, just outside of LA, and he's got, what are essentially a pair of industrial garden shears, and he climbs up in the rocket and he cuts around. And they launched the next day. Now, and it's funny for me as a journalist to watch a company evolve over time because, now they're much bigger. This is a startup mentality, and you want to take risks, and you want to push the boundaries. And now they're at this stage where they're on the verge, as George Abbey was talking about, of flying American astronauts from U.S. soil. And they're working with NASA to do that. So if you put human beings on that, where is the balance between, the innovative Silicon Valley culture and safety and reliability and all of that? And it's kind of fun watching that all play out here. But here's the thing. For all of the successes that Jeff Bezos has had and that Elon has had, they've yet to fly a single person to space. They've got their mannequins, which they do, and Elon's is called, Spaceman is Elon's, the mannequin they sent on the Tesla. If you saw this, the Falcon Heavy, and they put the Tesla into space. I think Jeff has Mannequin Skywalker, is what they call that one. And maybe I'll just take 1 minute about a story about the Tesla in space, because as a journalist, I was covering that, and I want to hold these guys accountable and look at it, and I just felt like, I was skeptical about that, and I said, well, couldn't you find a student research or science experiment, something? I mean, I know it's the first flight of the Falcon Heavy, and chances that the thing's going to blow up are pretty good, so you don't want to put a $300 million satellite up there. But couldn't you just at least find something that seems like a stunt, cross promotional for your other company, Tesla? And then you see the picture of the Tesla with the convertible, and it's red, and the mannequin in there with his arm perched on the car, and the earth behind it. And then I said, yeah, okay, I get it. I think for this next generation, it's not Buzz Aldrin standing on the moon, but it is significant, and it does hold a place. And if nothing else, what these guys are helping to do is reignite interest in space. That maybe my generation, who didn't see Apollo and weren't captivated by, crossing new frontiers, all of these kids are, the SpaceX webcasts, you can go back and look, they get hundreds of thousands of page views. It's really something. But getting to human spaceflight, which we're on the verge of with Blue Origin and SpaceX, they haven't done it. But depending on what your definition of space is, and this has become a little bit controversial, Virgin Galactic has. In December, they sent on a space plane. They had a flight that went to the edge of space, went over 50 miles, which is, the FAA will give you commercial astronaut wings for that, and NASA recognized it as a space flight. So that was the first space flight from US soil since the shuttle was retired in 2011. Now, to be clear, it did not go to orbit. It just went up and came straight back down. And it's getting to orbit is, much, much more difficult. But I went and I watched it, and I was there for the Falcon Heavy launch, and I've been there for Falcon 9 launches. When you're on the Cape and that rocket takes off, and even though you're a couple miles away for safety reason, you feel the thunder in your chest and the smoke and the fire, and the way it just crackles going to space. It's incredible. And now with SpaceX, because they fly their boosters back, and you see it coming back, and you hear the sonic boom, it's a visceral experience. And this flight, the Virgin Galactic flight, was not that. I mean, you almost had to, it took me a minute to even find it, because it's, so high up, and it's tethered to this mothership of a plane, and then the spacecraft drops into the space plane, and then it lights its engines and it shoots up. And they call it air launch. And you had to kind of wait and see it, but there were 2 people on the flight. And the fact that there were people on it, we're standing, and the sun's coming up in Mojave, and we're standing on the flight line, and there are all these engineers who are there, and all the employees for Virgin Galactic, and Richard Branson's there, and his family's there. And it was really an emotionally charged moment. I mean, I felt it. Even I, as a dispassionate reporter, had goosebumps, I'll admit. Because in 2014, they had an accident, and their space plane came apart, and it killed the test pilot. And there was a question about whether they were going to proceed, and there was this quest that obviously what Richard Branson and Virgin Galactic are doing is far and away very different from particularly SpaceX. Blue Origin does have a suborbital space tourism component, but that's what Virgin is focused on right now. It's something like 560, 570 people have ever been to space in the history of the world. That's it. Virgin Galactic has about 700 people who have signed up to go to space, and now they've done it twice. And on their last flight a couple of months ago, they had a crew member go up and practice unbuckling from their seat and floating around the cabin. She told me she did that twice to sort of see what the experience was like. And that's really significant, and it brings me back, and I'll be happy to take questions in a minute here, brings me back to my first memory of space in the Challenger disaster, and how on that flight, again, it was Krista McAuliffe, and NASA, the idea for the shuttle was to be affordable, reliable, efficient, all the things that these entrepreneurs want to do. And they wanted to fly not just astronauts, but civilians, ordinary people to space, and give them that experience. The space shuttle was called the shuttle for a reason, that connoted something. And after the Teacher in Space program, there was to be a journalist in space program, and you had some real luminaries apply for that. Walter Cronkite was a finalist, Jay Barbie of NBC News, John Noble Wilford of the New York Times, or a couple of Washington Post reporters. And NASA was very keen on flying ordinary people. And even they had done a survey, and I'll read this to you because it's from Maya Angelou, responded to a NASA survey about going to space, and she wrote, "As poets over the centuries concentrated on Grecian urns, nightingales, ravens, and romantic love, I am certain that poets in the future will focus on the configuration of planets, stars, weightlessness, and the discovery of our universe." Sort of on the other end of the artist spectrum, John Denver, as it turned out, was a huge space fan and was lobbying really hard to go, and actually pulled from the NASA archives some of his letters that he wrote to the NASA administrator. And he was talking about his experience. He was an airplane pilot. He was certified in scuba diving, a professional photographer, an amateur astronomer, and an experienced outdoors person. He bragged about how he was running 4 to 5 miles every day and in excellent health. And I just thought that was so fascinating that you had him do it. And what they were seeking was, you hear this, astronauts call it the overview effect. And while I think a lot of people sort of dismiss the suborbital space tourism flights, it could really be something if you're up there and you have that experience seeing space. And we're doing a project right now for the Washington Post where we're interviewing 50 astronauts for the 50th anniversary of Apollo to get a sense of what going to space is really like. And I interviewed Sandy Magnus recently, who was the commander of the very last space shuttle mission, and I'll read you her quote because I just love it. "Gravity sucks. It's horrible. One of the most interesting perception changes that I had as an astronaut is one I never expected, and that's my perception about gravity. We leave the effects of Earth gravity because we're in free fall all the time, and we adapt to this new environment, and then we have to come back to gravity, and it's like, oh my gosh, what the heck is this? I can't believe we live in this all the time. I mean, it's just horrid. It's such a huge force, and it's really pressing down on us every day. And it's astonishing when you first come back into the influence of Earth's gravity. It's astonishing to feel that and go, wow, I can't believe we cope with this. But of course, we've adapted to it. And so it's normal for us, but it's not. It's weird. There's another way to live, and you experience that on orbit. Now, clearly, the suborbital space flights are just a 4 or 5 minute taste of that. It's not on orbit. But we're focused on, going to the moon now, and the White House has talked about returning humans to the moon within 5 years. But let's take for a minute the view that, say, Virgin Galactic is successful, and we'll be optimistic for a minute, despite their past failures and despite the fact that they may have more failures. And that it's 10 years from now, instead of 570 people who have been to space, it's maybe 5,000 or maybe 10,000 or 30,000. And they're having this experience where they see Earth from a distance. They see the thin line of the atmosphere. They see the darkness of space, even during the day. They see land masses with borders. They have that experience in microgravity. I think that could be really profound. And, there's a new generation coming up and being enthusiastic about space and what I think is a new space age. And you can think of the kind of memories that they'll have. Thank you very much. I'd be love to take your questions.
I think Chris has agreed to take some questions, so we have a microphone here, so go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Could you bring it home to Texas? So SpaceX has some Central Texas facility, and Bezos owns half of West Texas, and there's the new spaceport in Harlingen and the plans for Ellington. Could you say what you found about the Texas angle here?
Yeah, so I kind of skipped over the story, but in 2003, Jeff started buying land in West Texas, and he did it very quietly and secretly because, if people knew who was buying the land and how rich he was, they'd drive the price up on him. So he used these, sort of corporate ventures, all named for explorers, to secretly buy the property. And I calculated the total amount in my book going through land records, but it's something like 30 or 40% the size of the state of Rhode Island. I mean, that's how much land he's got out there. And he's talked about, if you're launching rockets, you need a buffer zone. And his, he's got his 10,000-year clock. That's out here. And Jeff has real Texas roots. His grandfather had a ranch in South Texas, and Jeff spent every single summer of his childhood at that ranch with his grandfather, going to the local library and reading, devouring, really, their science fiction collection. And they just had a launch from there a few days ago. And you see Jeff. Yeah, that's right. And so Elon's building his own private spaceport down on the Gulf. He's got 2 launch pads, in Florida, and 1 in California he uses, but he wants his own spaceport so he doesn't have to sort of deal, if there's a government launch or one of the other companies is launching, the calendar gets a little crowded, so he wants his own space. An interesting story about it's in McGregor, Texas. They have an engine testing facility outside of Waco. And what's interesting, there's a little bit of a backstory there because it had been used before him by a guy named Andy Beal I believe he's from Dallas, and sort of preceded these guys as sort of a billionaire wanting to get into space. And he was using this site to test his rocket engines, and ultimately he decided he wasn't able to crack into the government market. He wasn't able to, compete with the military-industrial complex, the Boeings and the Lockheeds, and, was sort of a symbol that, this was still the government's game. And then a year or so later, along came, this guy, Elon Musk, who took over that site. So yeah, Texas is, central to a lot of their activity. Yeah. Maybe over here. We'll go back and forth.
I'm just curious, what's your opinion on the Air Force's launch service agreement, and do you think it's good for innovation in private space, and what 2 companies do you think will win it?
Well, actually, it's an extension of what Elon was suing about what I started off talking about. It's the Air Force, right, picking the rocket providers that it wants to fly national security payloads. Before SpaceX got in the game, and just to finish the story, he sued for the right to be able to compete against the United Launch Alliance, which is a joint venture of Lockheed Martin and Boeing. So here you have this unproven company called SpaceX taking these guys on. They ultimately settled the case, and Elon and SpaceX have been flying those. Now there's a new batch of contracts, and they want more competition into it, and they've funded Northrop Grumman, Blue Origin, and the United Launch Alliance, and SpaceX already has its certification. My opinion about it is strictly as a journalist that, boy, there's a lot to write about because it set off a firestorm in Washington, and you've got the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee writing letters, and these contracts over the course of the many years are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So there's a lot at stake for those. So it set off a scrum in Washington for all of that. As to who will win, it's hard to say. I had a conversation with some industry folks who would say maybe ULA and SpaceX, but there's concern about that because they're the incumbents now, and will there be room for a new entrant? I don't know. We'll see how the politics plays out. But read the Washington Post because we'll have some coverage of that coming up. Yes, over here.
Hello. Yes. So I've read an article on GeekWire.com that says that Bezos is planning a moon settlement in 2024 or something like that. And I was wondering, they're going to need a power source, I'm guessing, so they'll probably have solar panels. And if they have solar panels, I'm wondering if they'd be willing to test a transmission of microwave energy from those solar panels to see if we could receive it on the Earth as a potential alternative power source, lunar solar power.
Well, you'd have to talk to them about that, but yes, you're right. They have a plan, which Alan Boyle did write about in GeekWire. He's a great journalist, but the Washington Post did break that story a couple of years ago that actually Jeff has a plan called Blue Moon. And a lot of people think he's going to talk about this in a few days in Washington, and I'll be there, because Blue Origin tweeted out a picture of Ernest Shackleton's ship when he went on his voyage to the South Pole. And a lot of people read into that, and Jeff has talked about this, and NASA wants to go to the South Pole of the moon, to Shackleton Crater, because there is continuous sunlight there, which is good for energy source, but also within Shackleton Crater there is water and ice. And that is obviously important for human life. Water to drink, air to breathe, but it is also rocket fuel, hydrogen and oxygen. And, you have heard Jeff, and even now in the Trump White House, Secretary Wilbur Ross of the Commerce Department talks about the moon as being a gas station in space, and so as a way to go forward. So, as I mentioned earlier, there's this mandate from the White House to land humans on the moon by 2024. I think Blue Origin would like to be part of that architecture. It's called the Gateway. It's sort of a space station. They don't call it a space station, but it's essentially like a space station. Wouldn't have astronauts on it continuously the way we do on the International Space Station. But then you need the elements, the landers, to get to the surface of the moon and then back to this station called the Gateway, and that's what they want to be involved in. Okay.
So thank you for your talk tonight, sir. What these gentlemen have done in space truly is revolutionary compared to what you talked about with it used to be kind of all government and now there's private as a whole industry. Do you see, kind of with your experience, being able for more people to come into the industry, or do ULA and SpaceX and Blue Origin have kind of the capacity and have taken over the whole market? Stuff like Araya, with their water-propelled rocket, kind of a new energy solution that they're looking at. Are more companies going to kind of flood in, or is this commercial space to some extent kind of already filled up?
It's a great question. And the answer is I don't know that we know, right? Jeff Bezos, richest man in the world, has pledged to spend $1 billion of his own money on Blue Origin. Obviously, there are not a lot of people who can do that. SpaceX, while Elon has invested a lot of his own money into it, SpaceX does not exist, let's be clear, without NASA, without the government and the Pentagon. So is there a tipping point where they fully can stand independently in a self-sustaining economy? That remains to be seen. The government now is still the driving factor. even though Jeff Bezos may have the wealth of a government. The interesting thing, though, we focus, particularly in the press, on the billionaires and the guys with the rockets. But that's not all of the space industry. There are companies that are building habitats. Satellite industry, that's a whole other thing. To think that a satellite would cost $300 million, be the size of a school bus, and have to last for 20 years. Now, they're much smaller, much more inexpensive, and they're the size of a shoebox. And you're seeing all this talk about putting up constellations, if not dozens or hundreds, but thousands of them. There's a company called Made in Space that does 3D manufacturing in space. So that if we are on the surface of the moon and you can, mine the propellant for your rockets there, then maybe you can mine and use the resources to build your rockets, so you don't have to build all of that. So, I do think there is sort of a growing space economy, but the key is getting the launch prices down.
Thank you, sir.
Sure.
Question.
Yeah.
Have you seen a shift in public perspective as far as space and our ventures there? It's funny that you mentioned your first experience. My first experience was, I guess, as a teenager with a Columbia, so kind of similar. But as a journalist, have you seen a shift in the recent decades?
Yeah, I mean, look at, there are a lot, like I was mentioning earlier, the people who sign on and watch the SpaceX launches. They sell a lot of gear. Elon's just got this sort of rabid fan base. That, boy, if you write something that they don't like about Elon or SpaceX in the Washington Post, they let you hear it. So I do think there's a shift. I think that image of the Tesla in space was something. The images, as Mr. Abbey was talking about, of the multiple boosters coming back and landing at the same time, has sort of reignited interest in space to a certain extent. But when there's human spaceflight again, I kind of think that would be significant, that when you have a person on the rocket, which is apparently coming soon. Yes, sir.
Yeah, interested in their long-term vision, and have beyond the moon, have either of them or both of them articulated where they see this going the next 40, 50 years. And part of that is, do they I would think Jeff does, point out and recognize the limitations. Like, for instance, to get to Mars, I've been told by an astrophysicist that overcoming the radiation poisoning on humans is such a constraint right now, and they haven't solved it yet.
Right.
But we all hear about going to Mars, and well, but first you got to do this. So I'm interested in hearing what their vision is for the longer term.
Yeah, so, and Jeff agrees with you about Mars. He says, if you want to know what Mars is like, go to Antarctica, because that'll make Mars seem like a garden paradise. Mars it's freezing, there's radiation, it's just not, it's for only the very hardy, and getting there, the radiation poses real risks. At a time when we haven't been out of low Earth orbit since 1972. Elon wants to go to Mars yesterday and talks about colonizing Mars. And he, in 2016, gave this big speech about going to Mars, about why we needed to do that, that if anything happened to Earth, if it got hit by an asteroid, all of our eggs are in this basket, and we need to go and colonize another celestial body, and Mars is the best one. And somebody asked him at this conference, well, what about the radiation? And he just sort of offhand dismissed it and said, I don't think that's big a deal. And I know a lot of people, take real issue with that. Jeff has a different perspective. Excuse me. He says, instead of this whole Plan B idea that if something happens to the Earth, we need a Plan B, go to Mars. He says Plan B should be to make sure Plan A works, and Plan A is Earth, and Earth is pretty great. I mean, despite this horrible weather we're having right now, we've got palm trees and margaritas and bacon and all these wonderful things that you're not going to get on Mars. But ultimately, what he wants to do is be able to build that infrastructure so that you can preserve the Earth, but you do the mining elsewhere. Again, that's sort of the long term. But the steps to get there, so he talks about if he's 80 years old, and that's in 30-something years for him, if he's helped lower the cost to get to space to allow that to happen, or the seeds to allow that to happen, then he would be a very happy 80-year-old.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your talk today. I really appreciate it. One thing I'd ask you to look at, though, we're technical people. We love the rockets. We love spaceships. The policy foundation finally is in place to make this happen in the government. The Authorization Act 2010 and 2017 actually mandate that the government work for a permanent human presence in space beyond low Earth orbit. That's huge.
Yeah.
NASA's making that happen with the help of these great partners. So I'd ask you to look at that carefully and really help people understand the policy foundation of the government. It's right on the money, finally, after all these years. With Apollo, we got there, been there, done that, and that ended it. Sustainability is going to be the key. How do we go back to places? How do we build the kind of infrastructure? And the commercial partners, as the international partners, are key to that. So I'd ask you to look at that, too. Yep. One personal note here, Jeff Bezos went to River Oaks Elementary School right up the road here. And he tells his new employees that's where he learned about life. That's an impact he's had on Houston, and it's had on him. And he tells his new employees the power of that and how it's shaped his vision for the future, which is another connection to Houston side launch sites. Yeah. So, again, thank you for writing this.
No, thank you for that comment. You hear NASA talk about the collaboration, not just with the international partners, which we have on the International Space Station, but recognizing the commercial side. And obviously NASA relies on Boeing and SpaceX to fly crews, but you hear a lot more talk about that these days.
Well, it's more than talk. I mean, the commercial lunar resupplies, the commercial space services. Yep. It's more than talk. They're really doing the right thing to build a partnership, to build a sustainable enterprise, and they don't get much credit for that in my view.
Yep. No,
so
that's
I
right.
ask you to look at that very carefully, and the Policy Foundation makes that happen. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, real interesting talk. I appreciate you coming out today. And I guess from my perspective, I think of colonizing Mars as a potential refuge from a disaster on Earth as something in the very, very far future. And do you feel like these guys are really trying to create a commercial viability for what they're doing, or are they really just trying to take a very large-scale bucket list? I want to go to Mars, I want to go to the moon, something that only billionaires can put on their bucket list, but you think that's what's going on here? Or?
Well, so I mean, they're businessmen, and the interesting thing about, Jeff and Elon and Richard, they've run other businesses before they came to their space business and had success. So they understand what it is to stand up a business and to compete. And, if they want to achieve their goals, they've got to have they have to have a successful business to do it. Jeff, at this point, they sort of joke at Blue Origin that it's a nonprofit, but they're competing for this Air Force contract and are starting to come out and sign up, real customers, commercial and government, and get the, what's been so elusive for them over the years, which has been revenue, that they, there's that saying in space, no bucks, no Buck Rogers. And, they want to work, whether it's, self-sustaining economy on their own or with the government, however that works, they need to be successful in their business in order to check those bucket list items off.
Yeah. Okay.
Howdy, thanks for your talk. It was excellent.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you've talked to like Mr. Bezos or anybody about aliens and what they think about extraterrestrial life. I don't know. Yeah.
We didn't get into that, but Jeff is a huge Star Trek fan, and you can find this online. If he actually had a cameo in one of the Star Trek films as like an alien, and they dressed him up. So we didn't get to that, but I know, the science fiction stuff is, that's big with him.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I'm concerned about their refuse. Our country is sort of wallowing in our own trash. And China isn't buying our recycling anymore, making us feel very uncomfortable about our tariffs. Now, we're colonizing the cosmos. Earth is quite beautiful, but it's a bit tainted from our refuse. Have they determined in the building of what they're going to do to get people into the cosmos, what they will do with their refuse down here.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it makes me think of two things. One, when you set off all of these rockets, what are the environmental concerns of that?
Breathing.
And then you set up, you raise a very good question that I think, that a democracy, in an open society should debate where to put its resources and what's important. Do we take care of Earth? And there are a lot of problems here with poverty and pollution. And should we dedicate our resources to cleaning up the Earth, or should it be toward exploration? What is the balance between those? And I think that's a really good conversation to have. And I think it's an important one that, you want to dedicate all of this and give money to these billionaires when we've got, crime and homelessness on this planet. And a lot of the concerns that you raise, I will tell you from their point of view, and particularly Jeff's point of view, that he, wants to make money, and I do believe it's, there's an ego thing there. I do believe that there is a sense of altruism, that in the long run, it is a good way to help the Earth. That if you're not mining the Earth and using up all of its resources, but instead taking that and doing that in space, then that ultimately is a long-term way to help the planet Earth. But it is something they wrestle with, and it's something they're criticized for a lot, that they should, why with all of his money should he be giving $1 billion to fund his rocket company? Imagine where else that money could go. And I think that that's an important conversation to have.
Do you think they've talked about it?
I think they do, sure. I mean, just because they have to, and I've heard Jeff talk about it, and in his mind, going to space in the long term, I mean, he'll say, look, I founded Amazon, and Mark Zuckerberg founded Facebook in his dorm room at Harvard, and he was able to do that because the infrastructure was there. The cable lines were there for the internet. For Amazon, their postal service could deliver the books. There's this invention called the credit card that could take people's money. The infrastructure was there, so a kid in his dorm room could found an internet company. That infrastructure for space does not exist. It's too expensive. He wants to lay down that infrastructure so that some kid in his dorm room, to the point before about, the entrepreneurial nature of all of this, could found a space company. But now that can happen, and his dream of using space to help the Earth can't be realized until that problem is solved.
Thank you.
I guess I'm going to sign some books in the back.
I think we'll now proceed, and there are books for sale that I think you could have Christian sign. So, Chris, I'll let you go ahead and move to the table, and you can start signing.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming. Yeah, thank you.